Our next segment is You Are the Carbon They Want to Reduce, and I'd like to introduce General Partner from Castle Island Ventures, Mr. Nick Carter. And next, co-founder from Core Scientific, Darin Feinstein. And next, Master of Hash, Mr. Stephen Barbour. And he wins the Mustache Award of the day. I think it's beautiful. And next, I'd like to introduce Head of Mining Galaxy Digital, Miss Amanda Fabiano. Welcome. And this panel will be moderated by technology reporter from CNBC, Ms. Mackenzie Segalos.
Hey there. Today we are talking about Bitcoin mining, and it is one of the most fundamentally misunderstood sides of the network, I think, and it's also one of the biggest critiques. And I am joined by 4 experts who understand this industry inside out, on-grid, off-grid, renewables, co-locating with nuclear plants, flare gas, and we're going to get into all of it. I also just wanted to say that these 4 people are on my speed dial, and more often than not are on the phone with me at midnight on a Tuesday, teaching me about how Bitcoin mining helps to stabilize the grid, so I'm very grateful to have these folks breaking it down. I think where we start is the dynamic that is fundamentally misunderstood about Bitcoin mining, and that is the fact that energy consumption is not equivalent to carbon emissions. And I wonder if someone can kind of just tackle that definition and explain the distinction there, and then we'll get into the nuances of that. Darin?
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. Thanks for joining us. The energy footprint for Bitcoin is probably one of the most talked about metrics in the mainstream media of almost any industry. And so you would think that the footprint of the energy used globally by the network is massive, and you'd be wrong. It's an inconsequential number. What you hear all the time from mainstream media, except for Mackenzie, is that the Bitcoin network uses more energy than a small planet. Small planet. Too many cocktails. A small country. So what they say is the Bitcoin network uses more energy than a small country, the Netherlands, New Zealand. What happens is they frame the energy problem on a global basis, and they try to scare you into thinking that's a lot of energy used. Well, we know how much energy is generated on the planet Earth on an annualized basis. It's 160,000 terawatt hours of energy a year. 160,000 terawatt hours of energy a year is a very important metric to understand if you're going to have a conversation about energy use by the Bitcoin network. So that's the most important number to understand. And then you need to understand how much energy is used globally by the Bitcoin network. Before I tell you the answer, I'm going to tell you 2 articles that came out in 2017 that told everybody this. And the articles were written by, not surprisingly, the World Economic Forum and Newsweek. And the World Economic Forum and Newsweek in 2017, coincidentally, came up with the same math, and the math was that in 3 years, by 2020, the Bitcoin network will consume all of the world's energy, all of it, and you can look those articles up. They exist, unfortunately. And I was building a facility in 2017, and the people that came up to me were hysterical that we were destroying the planet, so I had to start developing a response to that. Well, we know that the World Economic Forum and Newsweek were wrong, right? Because the lights are on in here. We're not using all the world's energy by the global Bitcoin network. But how wrong were they, right? How wrong were these 2 mainstream media conglomerates that have a very important and very good marketing strategy globally? How wrong were they? Well, the Bitcoin network today, in 2022, 2 years after this prediction of Armageddon, uses 220 terawatt hours of energy of the 160,000 terawatt hours of energy that's generated globally. It's an inconsequential number. It's a fraction of a percent of the world's energy. Other large industries, manufacturing, automotive, when they tell you how much energy of the global energy that they use, they round it off by 1 or 2%, which means that this industry is a rounding error to other large industries. So you have to understand that the total energy used by this network, it's inconsequential on a global scale. Then we get down into regional and local scales, and those become more important to make sure that we're good partners with the existing grids. And I'm going to stop talking because I could.
So, and then on the carbon emitted side of this equation, right? Like that has to do with your energy inputs. And I wonder if, I won't put anyone on the spot, but does anyone want to tackle that? We'll get into like the more specific breakdown of power supplies, but does anyone want to generally speak to the carbon emission side of Bitcoin mining?
Well, a couple things about carbon emissions. Everyone's caught up on the total CO2 production, but emissions are generally a proxy of productivity. The more, generally speaking, the more we're emitting, the more productive we're being, because fundamentally there's nothing we can do that doesn't emit carbon. So I just find the whole thing with the carbon accounting for dictating if something is clean or dirty to be sort of a subjective, almost like a social credit attack on the world's energy network. Because at the end of the day, I mean, if Bitcoin miners are being paid to mine Bitcoin, that's because someone values it, and just trying to qualify that energy use as clean or dirty instead of how productive it is or how many jobs it creates.
Yeah.
It's sort of an odd thing to me.
Let's get into that, right? Like to justify energy being used, you need to be solving a problem. So what problem are we solving? It's accounting tech, but Bitcoin is also very much about freedom. So maybe Amanda, you want to?
Yeah, and I just think that we focus so much on the energy narrative, and we shouldn't. We should focus on like what Bitcoin does for the world. Look at like this event. Right, from last year to this year, there's been so much more adoption. And with the world's macro trends that are happening, like Bitcoin opens a door for more financial freedom. So if we judge everything on its energy usage, it's a crazy concept. Like energy usage is not a bad thing. It just comes down to what we think is useful sort of energy, or useful use of energy, right, for whatever. I personally think the best sound money that is open to the entire world is a great use of energy, especially if it's only less than 1% of the entire energy that is used.
In America, how are miners protecting the grids? And I asked this question somewhat in the context of Texas specifically. Spent a few months there, and I learned a lot about ERCOT and grid dynamics, and Nick was a very helpful tutor in that. But, I mean, maybe we look at Texas. Like in February of this year, a lot of people saw the storm that came through as this referendum of Bitcoin mining. A year prior, obviously, it was devastating to the state, and so people wanted to know whether Bitcoin miners would potentially exacerbate a storm situation. And what we saw were a lot of mining operations preemptively power down and do exactly what they were designed to do in this relationship that they have set up with ERCOT, where they are a flexible buyer who turns off. And so kind of going back to that first question I put out there, how are miners protecting the grid in the U.S.?
I can chime in here. So these three are the experts, and actually mine, I'm just sort of an onlooker. But I think the thing to understand is that miners are performing a single process trillions and trillions of times a second. That process is completed with each hash, and then it renews, right? It's a probabilistic function. It is not a linear sequential process where you need a number of things to happen all in a row for the sort of industrial process to complete. Now you compare mining to a cement factory or to an aluminum smelter or a steel mill. Those are sequential processes. They're complex. There's a lot of interdependencies. Bitcoin mining is one of the simplest industrial processes that exists. So that means that a miner can interrupt their load at a moment's notice. They can curtail it. They can modulate it up or down. And effectively, that makes them extremely good buyers of energy, because in response to either price signals or grid operator requests, they can curtail their usage at a moment's notice. And they can do this in a much more efficient and complete way than other industrial loads. So that means they can be extremely benevolent presences on the grid, where during a grid scarcity event, the miner will be able to curtail their usage. And if you look at the Texas power distribution, there's a lot of very cheap, in fact, negatively priced energy portion of the time, and relative abundance of energy much of the time. And then it's a small fraction of the time where there's a grid scarcity event, in 2021 most notably. So what miners do is they chop the tails off both ends of the distribution. They're scooping up energy that's otherwise going unmonetized, and then during that right tail of the distribution, when the grid is under stress and energy becomes very expensive, miners participate in programs such that they're curtailing their usage. Or they're just economically, it's not worth it for them to mine if spot prices go really high. So what they do is they fill in the valleys, or they chop off the tails of that energy price distribution, which is overall a very good feature for the grid, I'd argue.
Another grid dynamic that I want to get into is the idea of increasing its capacity and onloading renewable energy sources. And again, I go to this example of Texas, where you have all of this wind and all this solar power, but it's inherently very volatile. And when you add those kinds of energy sources to the grid, you need a base load. You need, the counteract, the demand to balance that out. Does anyone want to kind of get into that and explain the dynamic and how that's also increasing grid capacity?
Well, you have, as you pointed out, you have baseload energy, which you need all the time to make sure people can live their lives. Then you have intermittent energy, which is mostly the renewable energies. And intermittent energy is intermittent because it's not always running. It's not always generating energy. The sun doesn't always shine. The wind doesn't always blow. And so how do you create more energy generation on a renewable side? Well, you need, and this is well known, you need flexible load takers of energy so you can build a higher peak available energy footprint. When you create that higher peak energy footprint, you always have that energy available for emergency events, or if the intermittent energy is not available. And so what you find, and Nick just talked about it, is that you need to find a very specific customer that could just power down at a moment's notice if the grid asks. And the reasons are economic. If they ask you economic, there's a price increase because there's not enough energy available. There could be a controlled load event, or there could be an emergency, a weather event. And to find an industry at scale to power down is very difficult. If you look at the traditional data center industry and you ask AWS to power down, that's a really bad idea because people are going to die. They run air traffic control, they run the traffic lights, they have all the hospital databases. You don't want to turn them off. But as Nick just pointed out, you can turn off a Bitcoin mine in a moment's notice. Within seconds, we can power down. All that energy can be rerouted to the customers of the grid that need it. And at any point in time later on, we can power back on, and nothing happens to anybody of any consequence. And so that's why anytime you have a Bitcoin miner on your grid is stronger, because we're the first people to power down. And we've been doing that. Core Scientific, the company I co-founded, we've been doing that since inception. We have agreements with the grid operators in multiple states, and we report on a monthly basis how many times we power down and give that power back to the grid for whatever the circumstances are.
So Nick had talked about how this is changing the price dynamic. Like, you no longer are seeing as often negatively priced power or exorbitant fees. So on net, do we know if this is lowering prices overall in terms of how this is, personally being felt by people?
I would say it's hard to quantify. It's indeterminate. You can find papers that say, in a specific region in New York, these miners came in, and then the academics build a very fancy model, and it spits out, unsurprisingly, the result that miners increase the power, and they ascribe to a single variable power increase, which is a very multivariate model. But I think it's absolutely the case that miners are providing a unique and differentiated service to the grid operators themselves. They're effectively selling insurance products to these increasingly variable grids. And as you onboard more variable intermittent renewables, you need more insurance. You need more sources of grid flexibility. Now, demand response is not the only source of grid flexibility. You can have interconnections, you can import power from other places, you can do pumped hydro, increasingly maybe you'll do battery storage, things like that. But there's no question about it, and renewable-focused organizations agree, the world needs a lot more demand response capacity to deal with more renewable grids. And Bitcoin mining is the fastest growing demand response enabled industrial sector out there, and it does it in a much purer way than other industries do.
Generally speaking, power plants like generators have to oversize to to meet the fluctuating demand of the market, like just residences peaking in the day, troughing at night or whatnot. So because they have to oversize that, they put a lot of capital in that power generation, that infrastructure. So when that's already out there, you can consider that like sort of sunk capacity. So Bitcoin mines are a nice efficiency because they can load those up when they're, especially on the renewables that are already they have to be overbuilt due to their unreliability. They have to be overbuilt to bring in the renewable energy when needed. So building a Bitcoin mine for those applications would absolutely help increase their profitability for existing. What are you grinning at?
I'm just cracking up at the air quotes around renewable.
Well, there's nothing renewable about them, but like I don't want to. We don't have to.
We haven't had you on your soapbox yet. I want you to stand on that chair.
I usually refer to them as unreliables, but I picked that up from Alex Epstein. But they have to be oversized to do what the goal is, and that's to offset for these projects, wind and solar, like fossil fuel generation. So that is where Bitcoin is doing a really great thing, because it's this sunk capital, this sunk capacity, that curtailed power is actually getting monetized. And you see that in every sector, including oil and gas, which is largely upstream of the grid.
Yeah, let's talk about oil and gas for a minute. So I've been reporting on Exxon, ConocoPhillips, and other oil and gas players getting into the Bitcoin mining business. It's fascinating, this dynamic of off-grid mining. So we just were talking about on-grid mining, and now we're talking about going to an oil and gas field and, bringing a trailer of Bitcoin miners, putting them on the oil pad, and then using natural gas that you can't get it into a pipeline. And so your options are, Steve should be explaining this. Steve, explain how this works.
You're doing a wonderful job. So, that's our company's background, is primarily off-grid oil and gas, Bitcoin mining. There's a lot of problems that an oil and gas producer will face. Sometimes it's jurisdictionally dependent. The U.S. and Canada, we have different regulations. But generally speaking, you produce oil, you have associated gas. It's sort of like opening a can of pop. You have all that foam that comes up. It's just like an oil well. And that gas is hard to get to market. So oil and gas companies, they want to get it to market. But if it's not economically feasible to get to the market, they only have a couple choices. And that's, well, of course, use what they can on site, which is what they do, and dispose of the rest, and is in the best manner they can, in the most efficient, call it waste disposal manner they can. And that'd be like something like flaring, or in some cases venting. So the upstream oil and gas industry, which is a very distributed, call it upstream of the grid, there's a huge opportunity there for Bitcoin miners, and we're seeing it. I don't know if anyone was in Houston last week for Empower. That was a great conference, and it was all oil and gas and Bitcoin people, and the absolute electricity and the growth in that space is something else.
I think that's really a cool thing, right? Because you have oil and gas industry coming into mining. You have traditional energy companies now looking into mining. And then you have miners who have been looking for those low costs of energies coming in. And Bitcoin is an option for all of them.
Yeah.
And just to the point earlier on, like grid, stabilization, the great thing about like Bitcoin in general is it is this decentralized network. So if Darin decides to power down in Texas, there's still miners somewhere else, right? And we saw this happen last year with the Chinese ban, right? 50% of the network went online. Network still operated perfectly. And so Bitcoin is like the perfect solution for people trying to, be in locations where you can use the energy grid to your advantage.
Mm-hmm. No, I immediately thought of Kazakhstan, which is, become a major destination for Bitcoin mining in the wake of China's countrywide ban against the industry. And it was the exact same thing. You had the power network go down, like a lot of the mining, it was no longer happening, and it didn't affect the network. Like, it didn't skip a beat. It's a very interesting dynamic. One other thing on oil and gas that I wanted to ask about, I was chatting with someone on your team, and he made the point that like a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, he was being laughed out of boardrooms with this idea, and now it's very much becoming a mainstream practice. And I just wanted to ask you about this normalization of Bitcoin mining in the oil and gas industry.
Well, we still get laughed at at executive meetings sometimes. The price of oil is so high, they're like, oh, that payout is crap. Like, I just drilled more wells, right? But the dynamics definitely changed. When we started, we're Upstream Data is my company. It was sort of 2017, we were sort of drumming up the Bitcoin mining in the oil field, and we got our first skids out there. And there's a lot of skepticism. But it's sort of turning around. I mean, we're still finding a lot of resistance with oil and gas companies to actually self-mine their own coins, which is always what we've been pushing because it's just the natural fit. Because the thing about oil companies is if they start using this tech and if it's an emissions reduction thing that they have to do for regulatory compliance, or if it's purely they just don't want to waste that limited resource, they get the most benefit because especially when it's like a compliance thing, if they have to drop their flaring rates or their venting rates, they'll actually produce more oil because of it. They can turn up the oil tap. It's sort of like, they can, the more, I guess you shake up that pop can, the more Coke can come out, but with that, the more gas. So they can turn up the taps if the Bitcoin miners suppress their allowable vent rates or flare rates. So it's actually a match made in heaven for oil and gas companies because it's a portable, I like the term digital pipeline, right? It's a portable sales point, and it allows them actually to do their core business better than they would otherwise, more so than just mining Bitcoin and making the Bitcoin money. So.
A year ago at this time, at this conference, Nick Carter said nobody is writing about this westernization of hash rate, and they should be. And then I did. And it has just been this black swan event for the industry. And maybe Amanda, do you want to talk about just how significant this transition has been in the last year?
Yeah, so I sit in a pretty interesting spot at Galaxy. We both mine for ourselves, and then we provide financial services to miners. So a lot of the miners that are trying to build or looking for more capital are coming to us. So we have like a relatively holistic view of what's going on, where the network's going, and it's been really fun to watch. There's a lot of new entrances of people that see the value in mining, right? They see companies like Core, in their press releases coming out and seeing like how much value they're being created, and I think people are really interested in it. The westernization of it is kind of fascinating. So at the beginning of last year, we had 2 public mining companies listed on the NASDAQ. At the end of last year, we had about like 20. And so there was this proliferation last year of this push towards getting access to that public markets for liquidity and for more access to capital. Because as we all know, it's really expensive, right, to get a mining company up and running. And I think what that has done is it allows us to see more into the network, right? Like we're able to see like how big is each company's hash rate, right? Like how much are they growing? Where are sites going to? And so it's been, for me, the last year has been this year of transparency in Bitcoin mining. Traditionally, it's been a really, I don't want to say shady industry because that's the wrong word, but more like guarded industry because your secrets are how you build and where you get cheap power. So the Western migration has been fascinating, but I think it's also matured the industry a little bit because we can understand a little bit more of like what's going on with each company.
Yeah, and it certainly changed the power mix. The U.S. is now the _1 destination for Bitcoin mining on the planet, and I want to get into the nuances of how that's changed. But first, I want to ask. Is it upwards of 75% of the Bitcoin network was in China before this ban. Now it's largely in the US. That percentage keeps going up. I'm referring to data out of the University of Cambridge. My question is it a bad thing to have so much of the network centralized in any one country, whatever the country is?
I guess it is, and it isn't. I mean, we don't want Texas to get over 50% and the governor, orchestrate a 51% attack or something. But, decentralization, I guess, is only as important as when it's needed. It's sort of, I was doing a panel yesterday, I was talking about like regulation and can cause decentralization because if it's rules that puts a miner out of business, they might what happened in China with basically the CCP, a regulator coming in and kicking them out. Well, that in a sense decentralized the hash rate across the globe. I mean, to all those countries you mentioned, the U.S., Kazakhstan, etc. So decentralization is sort of like a response to censorship or regulation. We absolutely don't want everything in one. Like you don't want all the hash power, all the ASICs owned by few entities. You want that spread out as best as possible. But at the end of the day, I mean, all we can really do is as individual miners is try to make money. And there's going to be certain forces that cause it to centralize, like fiat. Fiat money printing is a centralizing force, right? It's a consolidating effect. The people that are close to the money printing spigot, they get the lowest cost of capital, they get to buy up assets, they can centralize the hash rate. But there's other forces like regulation that will push it the opposite way. So it's like a balance, I think.
And we're seeing the network diversify and distribute globally. There's sovereign wealth funds and governments globally that have been looking at initiatives to pour hundreds of billions of dollars of capital into the industry in their region. So I think
Where? Or tell me off stage and I'll write it up.
But so we're seeing this diversification happen. It's going to happen naturally. We benefited, as you said, from the Chinese government shutting off the industry within their borders, and they had such a big footprint. And I think the Chinese people are going to, this is the biggest economic, financial, and accounting technological innovation in our lifetime. And I think where you shut this off, you harm your economic your ability to perform on a world stage. Because of the openness, unalterable, immutable ledger, that this is what this technology is. It's an accounting ledger. It's the most important accounting ledger ever invented. And if you cannot participate in it, you're going to miss out on the billions of human beings that are going to be on this network. And we've seen that rise. I mean, when we first built our first building in 2017, there were 2 million people on the Bitcoin network. Now we're somewhere between 120 and 150 million. If you look at that growth trajectory, it's very similar to the internet. And you still saw, even with the internet, I think it came out in to the public in the 80s. People started using the internet in the 80s. And there were articles in the late 90s, 98, 99, saying the internet was a passing fad. So 14 years after the internet came out, people were already writing it off. So we see the same messaging going on with our industry that happened previously with these others. Same thing on the energy footprint. When emails came out, guess who didn't like it? The U.S. Postmaster General. He doesn't like emails because that takes the amount of postage that goes out and reduces it. And so how does he combat emails? He says emails use too much energy because you can quantify it because it goes through a server as opposed to all the trucks and the humans and the buildings that you need to build the post office. And he actually went to Congress. The U.S. Postmaster General went to Congress and he tried to stop emails and implement a stamp tax. They tried to put a stamp tax on every email in America. Unfortunately, they did not succeed. But so any analog system that goes to a digital system, we start to see the energy and the reason for our panel, the energy and thus the carbon footprint. I think it's also important to point out a miner is a silly word for a computer server. That's all it is. A miner is a computer server in a data center, and that computer server, it emits zero carbon. There's no carbon that comes out of a computer server. The carbon comes from the energy generation source. And so you got to look upstream to see where the energy comes to power that.
And let's talk about that. So when you think about the power sources in China, like obviously coal power plants were a part of it, but there was also a lot of hydropower during the wet season. So how have the energy inputs changed now that much of the network has migrated to the U.S.? Amanda, or?
Sure. So I think, one of the things that has come out over the last year too is something that Darin and I worked very closely on was the Bitcoin Mining Council. And I think, we were, and not to speak for you, Darin, but we were kind of sick of this narrative, right? This push that everyone was saying, like, Bitcoin's so dirty. We were like, it's not dirty. We're all using, relatively clean energy. So a group of miners came together and we just said, hey, let's just share our energy sources. And, we release quarterly data for anyone that wants to join. And last quarter, we accounted for almost 50% of the network, and that was a 66% sustainable energy mix. And when you compare that to other industries, one, you don't know other industries' energy mix, right? Like, they're not transparent at all. Last year, we did a research report. We tried to look into the gold industry, and we tried to look into the banking industry. Like, encourage you to try to look for their energy sources, because it's absolutely impossible to collate it and find it. So I think, the network itself and the participants in the network are like good actors that are just saying, like, yeah, we use energy, but the majority of it is clean, right? And I think, it's just like incredible how much has happened over the past year to really like push the industry forward, and also like really focus on that, energy narrative, like kind of squashing that narrative.
One thing that's interesting to me in terms of renewables in the U.S. is this idea of creating a financial incentive that doesn't exist to build out this infrastructure. And I've actually, there's news coming out at 10:45 on this that's going to get at that. But what I want to ask you is for someone on the panel to explain this dynamic where you've got stranded renewable assets in West Texas that you can't otherwise get on the grid, and Bitcoin mining can actually help to give these players a reason to build out infrastructure to harness that energy. And Nick Carter obviously is going to tackle this.
I think Steve might have a contrarian take on this as well, but look, the energy, building an energy grid, you don't have perfect knowledge of the future. You don't know what's going to happen, decades from now in terms of demand. And energy grid operators, their job is to match supply and demand. When you're building out these assets, you expect them to last for decades, but you just can't know what the sources of load are going to be locally, years and years from now. And you don't know what the transmission is going to look like either, right? It's not just about generation, it's also about transporting that energy. So, of course, you end up with supply-demand mismatches. And if you look at maps of renewable or negatively priced power in the U.S., it increases every single year. It marches up and up and up. The negative pricing events in the U.S., particularly in the wind belt, going from Texas up north to Canada. And the reason we have negative pricing is because actually wind producers get a tax credit, and so they're incentivized to actually negatively price the energy. So that alone is evidence that there's a mismatch, and we don't do a perfect job at integrating new, especially renewables, into the grid. Oftentimes renewable assets, they're all correlated in the generation patterns, right? Because if it's windy, on the site of a wind farm in Oklahoma, it's going to be windy in the one right next door, and so they're both going to be trying to sell into that. There's just an enormous challenge that we have in terms of integrating these new sources into the grid and building transmission and distribution. So having that offtake ready to go, this economic pressure, is tremendously valuable. Now, I'm uncertain as to whether mining, off-grid with just renewables at a 20-40% capacity factor is going to work economically. However, the models we're seeing now from a bunch of innovative miners is a model where they engage in grid firming. So the economic offtake for maybe new renewable installations part of the time, and then they pull from the grid the rest of the time. So it's a hybrid model. And the critics always say, oh, it doesn't work, you can't mine with renewables. That's just not true. There's plenty of evidence that it is happening, and it's press release after press release. And I don't know what's dropping in 10 minutes, but I'm excited.
It'll be on CNBC.com. Steve, do you disagree?
I just find the idea of stranded renewables to be just like a mind, we're purposely building renewables. They're purpose-built projects. So why are they stranded? There should be more. It sounds like there's a lot of capital misallocation with those projects. Stranded gas, that's because it's an old oil field that's matured, or it's like the associated gas problem I described, where it's actually a byproduct of the oil and gas production. But if you're purposely building renewable, whether it's solar arrays or wind farms, this sounds like there's a lot of poor planning in place if all that energy being built out isn't going into the grid and offsetting what they're intended to do, which would be fossil fuels, presumably coal. So that's sort of like a bit of an odd thing there, because if miners are going to use any of that renewable energy that's being generated that could have been sent to the grid, then it's not doing what the original intent was, and it's being subsidized for no reason. It's subsidizing Bitcoin miners, in effect. And I just wanted to say that, like, I mean, everyone's so caught up on carbon emissions. Like, whatever happened to, like, job creation? Like,
Yeah.
you know, everyone apologizes for the coal they're burning, but what about the jobs and the local economy we're boosting? Like, I think that's a narrative. And since I'm on a public stage and I get to speak about it, I would hope that more bigger miners would start doing press releases about all the awesome things you're doing in your local economy. It's like, let's stop apologizing for the coal, or for the carbon and the coal.
I think we have seen that though, right? We've seen Riot come out and talk about how they employ over 300 people.
That's because we're all starting to troll on the internet, and it's good to see.
You're a good troll on
it's
the
It's a very
internet,
good to
so.
see. That's what we need to do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you talk about the capital allocation for a lot of the sources in the stranded renewable specifically, what you had is you have different circumstances that create those energy generation facilities. Specifically, not in Texas. I could talk about North Carolina and the Appalachian Mountains and that Tennessee Valley. The United States government in the 40s built a massive amount of infrastructure out there, critical infrastructure, that was hydroelectric plants. They dammed up, excuse me, they dammed up these Tennessee valleys and created hydroelectric plants, and they needed all of that energy to create the Manhattan Project atomic bomb. And after that was done, now you have 30 hydroelectric plants with a massive amount of hydroelectric power that's stranded renewable. They're generating the power. You can't move it past 500 miles, and it's just sitting there in these very unpopulated areas. And so Bitcoin miners like Core, that's where we located first, up where the stranded renewable energy was, as a result of the allocation of capital at the time was not misallocated. And so, but now when you talk, that's a really good point. In Texas, when we're going to start building, and you're going to see a lot of new projects coming online that are going to be renewable based and renewable generation power, you're going to start to see what that does, as you brought up before, what that does to price elasticity in Texas. And the conversations that we're having now are the opposite of what you think they are. The conversations now are, there's so many new renewable generation facilities coming online that they're worried that the price of energy is going to go to zero. It's going to go to zero, and it's going to put out of business all the legacy baseload energy. And so if that happens, then it's not economical for the baseload energy folks to stay in business, and then you lose your baseload energy, and you only have intermittent energy, and you have a big problem. So there's a lot of metrics that are going into play in terms of how people capital allocate, where these facilities are built, and even into the economics and price incentives on how you subsidize them or not. And so, but there's a lot of thought that goes into it. The larger scale Bitcoin miners, we love Steve and the rest of his the plebes, and we really but we really take it seriously, the messaging, which at the end of the day, we're all on the same team. We have a huge marketing problem on a global basis, because the forces against our industry are united. They're united against us, and they're very good at marketing. And the Bitcoin industry folks, we're decentralized. We like to do our own thing. We're all very entrepreneurial, the thought leaders and the founders of companies. And so we've gravitated towards this industry to kind of do our own thing, participate in the network as we see fit. And the problem is, and Amanda brought it up, the problem is that doesn't work on a marketing front, because there's a united message against us globally, and we're all saying our own thing on our own. And so for the last decade, as I've tried to explain to people that what you hear in the mainstream media is not necessarily true, we do it alone. And if we do it together, which was the genesis of the Bitcoin Mining Council, and we put out a quarterly report from the Bitcoin Mining Council every quarter, every 3 months, that says that talks to specifically the energy footprint of the network. And when Amanda says sustainability, that means carbon neutral energy. So carbon neutral energy, including nuclear. And so it's important to really combat the narrative that exists on the mainstream. It's tough to say collectively, but Michael Saylor had the best quote for the Bitcoin Mining Council, and it's, we could be decentralized, but we don't need to be disorganized. And the messaging in our industry, as you've heard today from everybody up here, is enormously factually positive. The facts in terms of energy use, carbon footprint, job creation is all positive. Innovation, technological advancement in America, it's all amazing. But if you look at any articles, they're united in telling everybody that this is going to burn down, literally use all the energy on the planet Earth and destroy everything.
So, and last question on this: what is your outlook for the industry? Is it on grid? Is it off grid? Is it on grid with miner-specific regulations like we're seeing in ERCOT? Is it outlawed in the West and it goes to petro states? Like, what are we looking at ultimately?
I think that is the most beautiful thing about Bitcoin mining. It doesn't matter. There's not a one-size-fits-all. There's people that are mining off-grid. There's people that are building massive, facilities in different locations that are jurisdictionally friendly. And I think that regardless of what that business model is and what that strategy is, Bitcoin doesn't care. It's going to continue to operate. It's going to continue to be decentralized. And we all might have different strategies, right, on how we think and approach the network. But it's going to continue, right? So I think that we're going to see more home mining, which Steve has been working on. We're going to see large companies like Core and Galaxy and all the affiliated companies that Nick works with, continue to grow and scale. And I think, the next year is going to be really interesting in mining to see what happens.
Steve?
Yeah, I see it moving mostly upstream in terms of like big industrial mining, miners that are going purely off economics, like money making. Upstream being towards the generating source, right? Because you have a generating source, you have a load, you have transmission. A lot of the mines right now are somewhere in between, right? A lot of the hash rate is somewhere on an interconnect. From a pure efficiency standpoint, there's certain upsides to that, like capital allocation, project execution. There's a lot of things that make that easier. Not that it's easy, but there's also some inefficiency, like transmission losses, which you don't really need when you have a portable load, a portable buyer of electricity. So that's why I see it going upstream. I mean, if you guys were in Houston last week, like I said, it's clearly moving upstream. There's so much going on in the upstream oil and gas industry. And I mean upstream anywhere. That could be hydro, like you're talking about the stranded hydro, the stranded wind and solar, upstream at the generating sources. But a lot of those generators, they're independent. They're not a lot of them want to get into Bitcoin. They don't want to invest in a Bitcoin mine, but that's sort of inevitable that they will, I think. And then we do sort of focus on the home mining now as well because we see a big opportunity there. I was saying yesterday that the way I justify saying it's both moving upstream and downstream. Downstream is how that's where you get the most privacy. You get the small scale mining at the most privacy. That's the people like the plebs, I don't even know how to say that word. They're interested in, and I know a lot of them are at this conference. I'm interested in KYC free coins. I like mining at home for that reason. It's not ever going to compete with the upstream sector or anything upstream of that because it's just the furthest down. It's going to be the most infrastructure cost to get you that jewel. But the upside is privacy. You get peak privacy, and it's hardest to find millions of home miners and shut them down versus one big guy like at the source.
We're over time, but really quick, Darin and Nick, give us some outlook predictions.
Yeah, I think, listen, Steve and Amanda hit both those points. I think building the infrastructure is the hardest part of this whole industry. The people can buy miners and try to go public with 10,000 miners, but you got to plug them in and you got to run them and they got to run efficiently. And building that infrastructure is difficult. Core, we have over 250 employees that build these facilities for the last half decade. So we're really involved in the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is very difficult. But the most important part of this are the plebes, are the users of this network, and really we can all come up here and sit on a panel, but nobody cares. It's all of you out there really understanding these numbers and the metrics so that you can go out and defend the network, which is why we put out so much material on it. All of the thought leaders up here, Amanda and Nick for certain, and me and Steve are working behind the scenes trying to build infrastructure out in our own different ways. But the real important part of you all, and it's really important for you to understand the metrics, because the facts are on your side. The facts are on your side. You need to learn a few of the facts, and then you could go out and protect the network on your own.
Nick, round us out. Last word.
3 quick predictions from me. Every major petro state, energy-rich state, especially the rogue ones, will have nationalized Bitcoin mining operations. It's just another commodity. They're going to take advantage of that. Mining in the U.S. and developed nations like the U.S. regulators will ask that miners opt into these flexible load programs. So you'll see it, but it'll be with some conditions. And then every major energy firm will obviously, and they're already doing this, much more than people know, they'll also engage in Bitcoin mining as an offtake.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.